Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly voyage of discovery into the wonderful world of books. The best of history, mystery, fiction, and nonfiction that I've been reading, as well as exclusive interviews with the authors of those books. That's right, it's here each and every episode of Books and Looks. And I just want to take a moment to say hello to our new partner. That's right, we have a partner now, booktrib.com. Booktrib.com to me is the best book review site out there. It's free, it's no paywall. You don't have to wait for a Sunday. There are books every day of the week. They're putting out new books. And it's also a place you can find books and looks each and every episode. So anyway, hey, thanks booktrib.com for partnering with us here at Books and Looks. Well, today we're going to go back to the time of World War II, but it's not a traditional World War II story. We're talking about a really fascinating story written by Simon Parkin, and he's here to talk to us about his book, The Forbidden Garden. Now, what is the Forbidden Garden? It was the first ever seed bank. It was established in Russia by a gentleman by the name of Vavilov. And it was also become a big part of the siege of Leningrad and what happens to these seeds and how do they preserve this seed bank. It's a dual story, the siege plus the seed bank. We find out some fascinating stories about the dedication of these scientists who had hundreds of thousands of seeds they were protecting and who made a vow. Listen to this, friends. They made a vow not to eat the seeds, not to eat the tubers, not to do anything, just protect them so when the war's over, they could use them to possibly help feed the country, the world, whatever. People died at their desk right next to the seed vault. The seed vault where all the seeds are, and people dying next to that because of starvation. It is an amazing story. And it's an amazing story of the fact that Hitler hated Leningrad, hated it to the point where he gave an order not to go on to Moscow, obliterate, destroy completely Leningrad. 850 days these people were under siege. Yeah, it's a bad story there. But this story about the seed bank, folks, this is a piece of history I never knew about. And Simon Parkin does a spectacular job telling us all about that in his new book, The Forbidden Garden. So without any further ado, let's go right into that interview because I'm Blaine DeSantis, and this is Books and Looks. Simon Parkin, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Simon, what a book. Wow. That's all I can say. Fantastic. What a great effort you had. Great stuff.
Thank you. That's really kind. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, it caught my attention from the get-go because it's something about history and about World War II that none of us knew about. I never heard about. You probably knew about, but I didn't know about it. Anyway, it was just something that I just took me by surprise. Didn't realize it. So anyway, let's get started about this because, you describe the Vavilov Institute. I think it's Nikolai, if I'm not mistaken. Nikolai Vavilov started that.
Yeah.
Okay. And the seeds. Now, friends, this is a seed bank, and this institute during World War II is protecting the seeds. How do you stumble upon this story?
Well, I was reading a newspaper article about a land dispute in the suburbs of St. Petersburg, which is the city in Russia that was known as Leningrad during the Second World War. And essentially, a developer wanted to build some apartments on this land. And there was a big outcry from the scientific community, both in Russia and around the world, because this land was owned by the world's first seed bank in the middle of the city. And it happens to have many rare trees and plants that had been planted by the botanists there in the 1920s and 30s. And so scientists were saying you can't build apartments here. And in the middle of this article I was reading, it just had a throwaway line saying that during the Second World War, a group of botanists who worked at the seed bank in the city had protected those seeds with their lives while the siege happened around them, the world's longest siege in history. And they worked in the middle of the city, and some of them gave their lives to protect the collection. And it's the kind of thing that you read and it sort of, grabs your interest. And then I went off and read everything I could about it and tried to find the story.
Wow. Well, now, for those of us who don't know about the siege, it's around 850 days or somewhere in that neighborhood during World War II?
Yes, nearly 872, I think. Nearly 900 days. Yeah.
My lord. And again, friends, if you haven't known this, he has a very fascinating fact in the beginning. I think you said 5 times more people died in the siege of Leningrad than died from the atomic bombs. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the numbers of people who died are estimates, but even the most conservative estimates put it the death toll at almost 750,000 people who died during the siege.
My God, and yet there are these people there protecting these seas. This is a fascinating, fascinating story. And I mean, it's a hard thing to do. What do you talk about the siege? Do you talk about the preservation of the seeds? How do you balance something like that when you start writing?
Well, my interest in the kind of books I like to write is telling a story. So, obviously, a lot of history books try to give a holistic view of a battle or, a particular uh, time period or whatever. But for me, I was particularly interested in the human story here of these people who these scientists who had given their lives, for 20 years, they've been traveling around the world trying to collect one copy of every plant and seed in the world. They traveled to 5 continents and brought these seeds back to the center of the city. And so, what was it like for them in the midst of this siege? Food is starting to run out in the city. They're faced with this terrible decision. Do we eat the seeds that we've collected, us and our colleagues? Do we distribute them to the people who are starving all around us? Or do we protect them for the good of science so that when eventually the siege ends, we can continue our work and hopefully produce crops that will feed many, many more people? And their aim was really to wipe out famine. And so this is the kernel of the story that I really wanted to focus in on. So I'm not trying to tell the whole story of the siege of Leningrad, only to tell the story of the siege through the eyes of these scientists who worked at this one building.
You know, one of the things that you mentioned throughout the book was Hitler's hatred for Leningrad. I mean, he goes to a point at one point says it should never have been founded. What I never heard this. Was there any reason for this other than he just didn't like it?
Well, Leningrad represented lots of things that Hitler and Nazism were against. It was a multicultural city, progressive in lots of ways. It was a melting pot. It had a dense Jewish population. It was the place from which communism had broken out in the revolution. And so symbolically, it was a really important target for Hitler and the Nazis. And in fact, after the German troops invade Russia in the summer of 1941, they receive an order that comes directly from Hitler that they're not to advance on the capital of city, the new capital, Moscow, until Leningrad has fallen. So I think that just shows you the level of importance in his mind of wiping out this city.
Wow. I never knew that. That's fascinating, fascinating research you had there for that. I never heard of that. Well, you talk about telling a story about people and things like that. There are brothers here. There's Nikolai and there's his brother Sergey. Okay, Nikolai is the botanist or I don't know exactly what he is, but
Yeah,
he's the
botanist.
main
Yeah,
man, botanist. Okay,
yeah,
and Sergey, I think, is a physicist or a chemist or something like that. And
yep.
and and their stories diverge, but yet they come back. And there is this family loyalty there. There's moral. How do you do things? And you have the political pressure. Tell us a little bit about those two gentlemen.
Yeah, so Nikolai Vavilov was the founder of the seed bank, which he founded in 1921. He was before that a university lecturer, and he took some of his students with him to Leningrad, which at the time was called Petrograd, and sets up this institute, the Plant Institute, in the middle of the city. And he is, as well as being a botanist, he's also an eager explorer, and so he sets out traveling around the world, motivated by this theory that when farmers were selecting the seeds and crops that they were going to use to grow wheat and other things that we use to feed ourselves, they may have overlooked some wild varieties of grains and wheats that perhaps had useful genetic properties for farmers. So he really wanted to go out, for example, into the mountains, try to locate wild varieties of wheat. And bring them back to study them to see if, for example, they were able to withstand the cold or they were resistant to pests or whatever. So this was really, the motivation for his work was to try to breed what today we would known as we'd call them perhaps super crops that would enable Russia to be able to feed all of its people adequately, which had been a big issue for the nation in the years before that. So yes, he is going out around the world building up this seed bank, but he does in the 1930s fall afoul of Stalin's regime. And ends up being arrested while he's out on one of these trips. He's gathering seeds in the mountains when a black car pulls up and four shady looking gentlemen say, Mr. Vavilov, you're needed in Moscow with us. Come with us on urgent business. And it turns out they are members of the NKVD, the precursor to the KGB, which everyone will have heard of. And he was arrested. He was charged with being a spy for Britain, which he wasn't, and he was sentenced to death. So at the beginning of the siege in 1941, he is in fact in prison, and all of his colleagues who work at the seed bank are left without their leader, wondering what on earth they're going to do.
Well, then what about Sergei? Now, he's also a scientist.
Yeah, he's also a scientist. He is more in Stalin's favor, and so he is not arrested. And some, after they learn of Vavilov's arrest, some of his colleagues and staff members actually go and visit Sergei and say to him, "Look, is there anything you can do to try and help your brother? He's been arrested on these trumped-up charges. We need to try and get him out." And Sergei, because he is, I suppose, aware of the precarious situation he's in and he doesn't want to be arrested himself, says, no, there's nothing we can do, sadly. And so it's a real family tragedy because Sergei is still working for Stalin's regime while knowing that they're persecuting his brother, and he's in prison awaiting his own execution at an unknown date.
Wow. What you talk about seeds. How many seeds had they collected for the seed bank by the time the war started?
Well, they worked very hard throughout the 1920s and 30s. By 1933, they had around 148,000 different seeds and tubers, which means potatoes and other root vegetables. And then by the time of the invasion in 1941, they had around 250,000 seeds. So that's how quickly this collection grew. It was famous. It was world famous around the world. The Times of London described it as the world collection of plants. And so, yes, it was really their ambition was to create a living library of all plant matter in the world. There had been collections of seeds before, but this is really the first time that there's such an ambitious project is staged.
Seeds are one thing. Potatoes. There were a lot of potatoes there. I mean, I don't know how many potato varieties they had. It was well over 100. I never knew there were that many varieties of potatoes.
I think they had 5,000,
Oh,
according to
my Lord.
one of the reports. Yeah, I didn't know there were that many either.
Oh, my word. My word, oh, word. Well, now, as you went and you did your research, did this increase your understanding of the expanse that this Vavilov Institute had? I mean, it's one thing to say, well, here's a seed bank, but when you actually go to research and see where they're at, it had to make a huge impression on you.
Yeah, it did make a huge impression on me. Yes, I mean the seed bank is still there today, so I was able to write to them and ask for their assistance in my research, and very kindly they would send me documents and diaries and memoirs of the botanists who work there, and they're extremely vivid. They went through once the siege begins and the German troops surround Leningrad, it's not long until the food in the city begins to run out. Really, a matter of weeks rather than months. And we can all imagine, if we suddenly were unable to get any food, how long might the food in our own kitchens last for? Well, that gives you a good idea of what it was like for the men and women at this time. And so it's not long before families are facing the terrible decision of having to, butcher their pets, their cats and dogs to eat those and, to find ways to survive. And because of this, there's a huge increase in the amount of rats and mice in the city because they suddenly have no cats and dogs hunting them. And the rodents can smell the seeds in the seed bank. And so in the first winter of the siege, the botanists who work there have to fend off this invasion of rodents who are trying to get into the containers with the seeds. And, reading some of these descriptions of what they went through and the measures that they took, it really brings all of this to life. It certainly did for me when I was doing the research and trying to capture that in the writing as well.
Wow. Well, it was amazing because while they were supposedly protecting the seeds, they were also told to go up and I guess sweep the embers from the bombs off the top of the roof.
Yes,
They
that's
were all
right.
over. Yeah.
Yeah, so Leningrad was, besieged by a bombing campaign like London in the Blitz, and there were German planes and bombers dropping incendiaries, and more than 100 incendiary bombs landed on the roof of the institute. And so as well as being scientists, they were having to be fire workers and go up onto the roof, and as you say, kick these bombs into the courtyard where one of their colleagues could extinguish them with sand. So it was
Oh my
very,
word.
very dramatic.
It was. It was. Now, how many botanists or geologists, or not geologists, but botanists, geneticists, whatever, worked at the institute at the beginning of the war? How many were there?
Well, it's difficult to get precise numbers, but there were at least 50 people who were working at the seed bank, just at the moment of the invasion, and perhaps more than that. And then it's they try to evacuate out of the city before the Germans arrive, and in fact, more than half of that number get onto a train and are hoping to make it out of the suburbs when the final railway station route out of the city is taken by the Germans. And tragically, the train has to head back and go back into the city. By the middle of the winter, the numbers of botanists who are still working at the institute has fallen to around 20, and that number goes down again until there's only about 13. And partly that's because from November 1941, many of the Plant Institute workers start to starve to death or are called to the front in order to lend their efforts to the Red Army.
Before, I guess it was before Nikolai was taken away. I think they all had made, or maybe it was right afterwards. They all made a vow not to eat the seeds, not to eat the seeds, not to preserve themselves. That was one heck. That was one heck of a commitment these people made, and they stuck to it, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's right. Yes. I mean, it's difficult to tell how many debates there were about this, but it does seem that there were some arguments, and some more junior members of staff were saying, look, this is ridiculous. We have duplicate sets of some of these seeds. Why don't we just eat those and preserve the main collection? But the leaders were determined and said, no, we don't know how many of these seeds are still viable if we plant them in the ground, if they're going to work or not. So we have to protect the entire collection. And the one of the most poignant stories for me happens on Christmas Day 1941, when Nikolai Ivanov, who's one of the leaders of the seed bank, knocks on the office door of one of his colleagues, Alex Stuchkin, and opens the door and sees his colleagues sitting in his desk chair not moving, and he runs over to try and rouse him and shakes his shoulder, and it's clear that Alexander has starved to death in his seat. And as he's shaking him, this packet of almonds falls out of his hands onto the desk, and he'd been cataloguing these almonds at the moment that he died. So it just shows you their determination to preserve the collection, no matter what the
Wow.
cost.
We don't know that. That's an amazing story. They would die of starvation. That just amazes me. Well, you have, of course, there are a lot of good guys, a lot of bad guys in this story but one of them is, I think you called him the first seed pirate, if I'm not mistaken. Hans Bruckner or something like that. Tell us about Hans Bruckner, who's a German, and what's his part of this whole book?
Yeah, well, Heinz was he was a young, relatively young botanist in the SS. So he was in his late 20s, and he had heard about Vavilov's collection in Leningrad. And because he's interested in seeds and plants, and one of his jobs as a member of the SS science teams is to try to find ways to feed the German people. And so he is eager to find a way to get hold of Vavilov's collection, and he manages to eventually convince his superiors to let him take a commando group in 2 trucks. They leave Germany and they drive into German held Soviet territory. And they start doing a tour of all of the field stations that work with Vavilov and the seed bank. and they turn up at each one and knock on the door and say, we've come to take the seeds that you have here, hand them over. And more than a dozen of these field stations relinquish some of their seeds to Heinz and his team, and they load up the trucks. They never make it as far as the actual seed bank in Leningrad because, of course, Leningrad never falls to the Germans. But they do manage to collect a significant part of seeds that derive from that collection, and they take them back to Austria to a castle in Lanach, where they start to run their own experiments under the watchful eye of Himmler, who's in charge of the SS. And so they're really, taking Vavilov's work and trying to continue it themselves for their own purposes.
So we had Vavilov doing it for his country, and Bruchner's trying to do it for the Nazis. And same basic outcome they want to have, but for different countries and different political persuasions.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I think probably Vavilov would say that he was doing it for the betterment of mankind, while as Brusha was just doing it for the war effort or whatever. But yeah.
Is this what we would now call, they would use these seeds? Was the purpose to be what we now call GMO, genetically modified? Is that what they're trying to do also, to combine these seeds to make better plants, better food sources?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say genetically modified in the sense that they're not, doing any gene splicing or anything like that. This is more like traditional agricultural crossbreeding of different strains of plant in order to try to inherit the characteristics of different plants to make, for example, a type of wheat that gives you a higher yield of grain that you can turn into flour. So this is really, their ambition is to make the amount of food that farmers are able to produce to increase that. Yeah.
All right. I read a story one time about a gentleman in Iran or Iraq somewhere who had taken all these fruit trees, and brought them together and did what you have to do, and the trees bore 12 different types of fruit. I never heard anything like that. It was an amazing story. So okay, so that they're trying to do they're trying to make things better, bigger, what will survive in this weather, and it was all very fascinating. And
Exactly.
were you surprised that the first gene bank was there in Russia? Did that surprise you?
Well, it's there had obviously been attempts to create collections of plants before and herbariums and things like that, all the way dating back to ancient Greece. But this is the first time that the term seed bank is used. There's a particular Russian phrase that we found that it roughly translates to seed bank, and it was the first time I believe that you had someone uh, with the deliberate goal of creating a library, essentially a library of seeds. So yes, it was surprising in a sense, but Vavilov was very internationally minded. He collaborated with scientists in North America, in the UK, all around the world. Wherever he went exploring, he would meet with farmers and ask them very kindly, ask them if they would very kindly spare some of their specimens for his collection. So it was an international effort, I would say, and that for that reason, that's partly why he faced the ire of Stalin, because this was seen as suspicious. Why is this Russian scientist spending so much time in America, for example?
Now tell me a bit about this his competitor. I would get from your book that apparently Vavilov was not enough of a peasant for Stalin, even though Vavilov's parents were peasants eventually. But he rounds afoul some other gentleman who has another cockamamie idea, and Stalin listens to him because of it fit the stereotype that he wanted.
Yeah, I think, yes, that's certainly partly true in that Vavilov came from a more well to do family rather than from peasant stock. And so didn't quite fit the bill for the kind of people that Stalin was looking to promote in his administration and the country. Um, but what is also true is that this rival Trofim Lysenko, as he was called, had different theories, scientific theories. He didn't believe in the same gene families that Vavilov did. Rather, he believed that a plant would inherit the characteristics of wherever the environment it was placed in. So if you planted wheat somewhere very cold, it would eventually become resistant to cold. So he had a very different theory of how plant science worked. And part of that theory was that he could increase the amount of food that Russia could produce in a much shorter time than Vavilov was. So I think that was the other reason why Lysenko was favored by Stalin's administration.
Was Lysenko ever able to do that?
No, no, because his theories were wrong, and so yes, no, they were
Yeah.
pretty unscientific. And but he had a political handler who was very savvy, who helped him to sort of raise the ranks. But yes, it didn't work out long term.
Oops. Oh my. Oh my. Yeah. There's something you just can't. It's stranger than fiction. I tell you, folks, it's amazing. You end up at the Millennium Seed Bank. The book ends, and I think you take a tour of the Millennium Seed Bank. We'll go back to some other things, but you talk about that, and are there parallels between what they're trying to do and what Vavilov was doing back in the 1920s and 30s?
Yes, absolutely. So the Millennium Seed Bank is actually close to where I live in the south coast of England. It's only about an hour's drive away, and I visited there, and this is a project that's been set up by Kew Gardens, the very famous botanical gardens in South London, and their aims are almost identical to those of Vavilov in the 1920s and 30s. They are trying to collect seeds, particularly from environments that are threatened, either through human habitation or wildfires or warfare or whatever it might be. All of these man-made reasons why plants can go extinct. So they're trying to save copies of these and bring them in. And they're also particularly interested in wild varieties, the same ones that Vavilov was interested in order to run experiments on them and see what interesting properties some of these seeds might have that could be useful to all of us in the world today.
Okay, I was not aware of that one. I knew there was one up in Norway or something like that, and
Yes,
I've even heard.
Svalbard. Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's the one that I had been aware of. Then I was doing some research, and we had even had some in America I was unaware of. So apparently, a lot of people are getting behind this effort.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, the seed bank you mentioned in Norway has some of the seeds that are in that seed bank have come directly from Vavilov's collection that he collected all those years ago. So so I suppose the sacrifice of the botanists that they made during the Second World War has reaped some rewards, at least in terms of that seed bank.
Wow, 80, 90 years later, we saw those seeds here. That's amazing. Now, part of this whole story about what's going on and about Leningrad is the fact that the Russian government controlled the narrative as to what happened, how it happened, who was the good guy, and that who was, what were we trying to do? There must have been a lot of a difficult time for you to separate the wheat from the chaff. I mean, the propaganda from the actual historical fact. Was that hard to do?
Very, very hard to do, yes, because of course, for the botanists who were working in the seed bank in the 1940s, their leader has been arrested on falsified charges, and even showing some loyalty to him could have feasibly seen them arrested and put in prison. And in fact, some of them who do try to get Vavilov released are arrested. So this is very risky. And then after the war ends and the siege of Leningrad ends, there's a certain amount of uh, covering up of exactly what happened, of how many people died, because some of those deaths were down to the lack of preparedness of the Soviet government. So it's politically difficult for, I think, the survivors of the siege, certainly in the early or late 1940s and early 1950s, to talk about what they had been through and to talk honestly about what they'd seen. So everything you read that has been written by them at that time, you have to, I think, read with that lens on, the idea that they're writing perhaps looking over their shoulder, worried about what might happen to them if they write down the wrong thing.
My gosh. Well, that's really amazing when you think about that. They came and talk about what really happened, and I got the feeling when I read your book that Stalin could have broken that siege had he wanted to, but didn't really want to. Did I misread that?
Well, I mean, yes, that's a subject for a whole history book, I think, is and there have been many books written about on that exact topic. So, but I think, yes, certainly, Academics and scholars of the Eastern Front would say that Stalin could have done a lot more to support the city of Leningrad, particularly in the early months when it was so difficult to live there and to exist with so little food coming in.
Yeah, the people made an escape. I think they tried to run a train or in the wintertime across a lake. I can't
Yes, that's
pronounce
right.
the
Yeah.
word. Yeah, where was that was
Yeah.
going to Finland, or where was that going?
Yeah, so part of Leningrad and St. Petersburg now is bordered by this huge lake, Lake Ladoga, and they were waiting for it to be that for the ice that freezes over the lake to be sufficiently thick that you could drive trucks across it, and that does happen in the spring of 1942, and that's when the real evacuations of the city begin. But of course, that was still a very perilous journey. Not only have you got to survive the journey across the lake, perhaps being shot at by German planes and artillery fire? You then have a very, very long train journey across the vast expanse of Russia to survive, often in freezing temperatures. So many people, even having evacuated from the city, then go on to perish, sadly, on that journey.
Yeah, and with no real support. I mean, when you're out there in the middle of the lake, you're out there in the middle of the lake. If the Germans are flying planes over you, watch out. You know what's going to be happening.
Yeah, there are stories, in fact, of people being bounced out of the trucks that they're in, and the drivers not stopping to pick them up. So, yeah, it was not a safe journey by any means.
No. When do we see a point in time when the research that you do that things got more open? You were able to get actual details. When did that actually start to begin to happen?
Well, we told the story of Nikolai Vavilov, who was sent to prison, and he did in fact die before the end of the siege in prison. He rather ironically also starved to death in his prison in Saratov. The only reason we know about the fate of Vavilov is because of the efforts of a Russian academic in the 1950s and 60s, Mark Popovsky, who takes it upon himself at great personal risk to visit the site of the prison, to interview some of the prison wardens who looked after Vavilov, to speak to the doctor that wrote that carried out the post mortem, and to try to find out what exactly happened to this great scientist. And so, yes, it's thanks he wrote a book at great risk to himself. He could absolutely have been in prison for doing so, called the Vavilov Affair, that he smuggles out of the Soviet Union and is published in the West in I think in the 1970s. And so, yeah, it's really thanks to the bravery and efforts of some people like him that we even know some of the basic details of this story.
Wow, well, it's fascinating. How long it took for this information to get out, and it's great that you have somebody who's that interest like you have to then bring it to all of us. And are you getting are you getting a feedback that most people were unaware of this?
Yes, I think so. I mean, certainly among people who work in seed banks, this story is fairly well known, at least the basics of it, that the botanists during the Second World War in Leningrad gave their lives, at least 19 of them, to save the collection. So if that's the area you work in, you've probably heard the basics of the story. But yes, I think, most people, even people who are very familiar with the Second World War and even with the Eastern Front wouldn't know this story. And this is the first book that, of course, I'm adding to research that has been done by others. I absolutely don't want to claim that it's all unique. But at the same time, there's only ever been one book written about the botanists who worked there in the Soviet Union in the late 70s, and it was very short. So this is the first book specifically that's trying to excavate, what it was like day to day, week to week. So yeah, that's been a real privilege, of course.
Yeah, yeah. There's a story about one gentleman. I have his name here. I think I have it here. Uh, Abram Kamarats, if I'm not mistaken. He went to go out to this potato train, the train. Remember the train you told us about? He tried to save the potatoes and he was actually knocked unconscious. Tell us just a bit about him.
Yeah, so the potatoes were planted in the fields during the first weeks of the invasion. Of course, it happened in the summer. So the potatoes, including very rare varieties that they collected from South America, were out in the fields in the suburbs at one of their field stations in a little town called Pavlovsk. And Abram and one of his colleagues, Olga, decide that they receive news that the German troops are not that far away, and so they convince military truck drivers to drive them to Pavlovsk each day, and they dig up the potatoes and ferry them back to the middle of the city. And in fact, as you say, Kamaraz is there on the day when the Germans arrive in Pavlovsk, and they start to shell the field where he's collecting potatoes. And we know this because he wrote his own recollection. He wrote it down. It's held in the seed bag. And yes, one of the artillery shells falls near him and knocks him unconscious and knocks his sack of potatoes open. And he comes to a few hours later. Pitt gathers up the potatoes and then makes his way back to the center of the city, and he successfully gets there as well.
What dedication? How far was it? I never could figure that. How far was it from that place to the center of the city? Was it a few miles?
It was a few miles, yes. I think maybe
Okay.
20 kilometers. I'd have to look exactly, but it's a decent walk.
Yeah, definitely a decent walk, no doubt about that. Hey, before we go, I want to bring up to all my listeners your book, The Island of Extraordinary Captives. That's another wonderful book. Tell the folks just a little bit about that, because you really, again, you get the people, you get the story. This is a great book. Tell us about that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, this was my previous book. It's about so during again, it's set in the 1940s, but it's not about soldiers or combatants. I'm particularly interested, I suppose, in ordinary people and their acts of heroism in these extreme circumstances. And the book tells the story of an internment camp on the Isle of Man, which is a tiny island in the middle of the Irish Sea, in between the UK and the coast of Ireland. And in the spring of 1940, there's a huge outbreak of paranoia here in the UK because Hitler's troops have taken France, and it looks like they're about to invade England. And in the years leading up to the war, Britain had accepted around 75,000 refugees from Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe, mainly Jewish people, but others as well. And so while the nation is gripped by this paranoia, what if they start to worry, what if among these refugees there are in fact Nazi spies who are pretending to be agents? And so there's this public outcry. Churchill and the government decide to round up all of the so-called enemy aliens and put them in internment camps. A similar thing happened in North America with the Japanese, of course. And my book, it tells a story of one of these camps on the Isle of Man called Hutchinson, where there happened to be a very high density of brilliant, renowned artists, writers, musicians. And when they get to this camp, rather than just waste their time, they decide to turn it into a sort of university or art collective. And so it tells a story of the individuals there and what they did with their time.
Wonderful book. Read that one too. That's just good stuff. I tell you, just good stuff. This is what you're going to get when you read any book with Simon Parkin. Just wonderful work, wonderful research, lots of human interest stories, which leads me to my last question. Basically, what's next for Simon Parkin? Where are you going? Where are you going to, what stories are you looking at for the future?
Well, I've written 3 books now from the 1940s on the backdrop of the Second World War, and I'm quite eager to do something a little bit different. So yes, I'm working on a book that's related to a court case in New York in the 1980s. So it's a very different sort of setting, but I'm really enjoying writing something a little bit more recent where a lot of the people are still alive and I can ask them questions. I'm enjoying that.
You coming over here to America to do any research, or can you do it all on the internet or through FaceTime or whatever you have to do?
Yeah, at the moment it's all been like this over FaceTime or calls or securing documents from American archives. But I certainly hope to come over and do some face-to-face interviews as well.
I'm in South Carolina. You can always come down and visit me. We have a room for you.
That's so kind. Thank you.
I'll tell you what, it's just amazing. The work you do is great. Folks, I don't want to keep Simon any longer than we have to here. He's done a wonderful job. This book, again, just a really, really fine effort, filling in details that we just didn't know about that much. At least he educated me, I can tell you that much. The book is called The Forbidden Garden. The Forbidden Garden by Simon Parkin. Simon, thank you for being on Books and Looks.
Thanks so much for having me.
Again, many thanks to Simon Parkin for talking about this new book, The Forbidden Garden. It is a really fine, fine book. Anything you read by Simon is really well done, real well researched, and you're going to really enjoy it. Now, I mentioned up front we have a partner called booktrib.com. That's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at their website. That's right. So many books. Yeah, so many books. They have giveaways. They've got bestsellers and trendsetters that are there. They have uh, book reviews on all of these. And it's not just on a Sunday, like maybe the New York Times, LA Times, Wall Street Journal, blah, blah, blah. Every day they got new book reviews up. They got books on business in the future, feature book reviews. You name it, they've got lots of stuff. They've got, lots of featured authors. They've got our show on. It's a wonderful, wonderful source. If you're looking for a book, you don't want to find something out about a book, there's no better place to go than to booktrib.com. And thanks so much for those fine people for joining and partnering with us. So very happy to have that. Anyway, hey, listen, on behalf of Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book.